I was really surprised when I started doing the research for this speech to learn that Winston Churchill had a speech impediment. One of the reasons why he credited to becoming such a wonderful speaker over time is that he spent immense amount of time preparing his speeches in order to overcome the speech impediment that he had. He came up with 5 ways in which you can create power lines that will improve your speeches. Now, you only want to use one power line in each speeches, but he gave a 5-part formula. The first is called contrast. The second is called rhyme. The third is called echo. The fourth is called alliterate. And the final one is metaphor. When I started looking for examples of each of these, I found many, many wonderful speakers who have clearly used these methods in developing their speeches, even though they didn't necessarily credit this back to Winston Churchill. So the first one is contrast. And in a contrast situation, if you're looking to create a power phrase with contrast, you want to start with what your speech is about. So sit down with yourself and write out a sentence that kind of gives the gist of what your speech is going to be about. And once you have that gist, then you can look at contrast. So you would take a list of contrasting words. These are opposites. One good example is when someone gives their wedding vows, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. It naturally contains the contrast. But if you take your gist of your speech and you look at a list of contrasting things, you may be able to find in there some contrasting terms that you can use to create a memorable speech. Benjamin Franklin, in his Poor Richard manuals, used tons of these little sayings that talk about opposites and how they work. One quote that I found was from George Orwell, in which he indicates, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." One good way to use this method in your speeches and develop the ability to do so is to create for yourself a list of antonyms. That means opposites. So that could be rich, poor, sickness, health, dead, alive. Rich, poor, any of these things will work, but you start with your gist, then you look at this and try to find a way to incorporate those 2 opposites into your speech. The second method is rhyming. I was surprised to learn that there's such a thing as a rhyming dictionary. How cool is that? So this is something that you could use if you're trying to come up with a rhyming phrase to use in your speech. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in one of his speeches, used the phrase, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And you often find these little pithy quotes are a good way for someone to remember a part of your speech, and that's often the thing that we walk away with from a speech. There is also a concept that you can use that is called the rhyming 9. And there are 9 rhymes that are used in many, many, many words. So if you start with the list of those 9, the rhyming 9, then you can help use that to come up with other rhymes to be used in your speeches. Those 9 rhymes are aim, are, ite, ache, o, I, ate, eam, and aim. And if you start with those 9, you will find an incredible number of words that you can use to rhyme with that. The next one is E, which stands for echo. And you will find that many speeches that have memorable phrases in them create that by echoing a portion of what is said. So they might echo a word, a phrase, a verb, something that happens over and over again in the speech. One of the most memorable one of those is from John F. Kennedy, and this is from his inaugural speech, one of his most often quoted speech, in which he says, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. And you can see that John F. Kennedy Jr. used the echo strategy very effectively in repeating, ask, ask, ask. Abraham Lincoln also used this methodology in his quote from the Gettysburg Address, where he ends with that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. The next strategy is called alliteration, and alliteration is simply when you use words that start with the same sound in a row, which helps create something memorable. I was surprised to learn that the best letter to use when you're creating alliteration is the letter P. And Winston Churchill himself provides us with an example of this in his quote, where he's teaching people how to speak. And the quote is, vary the pose and vary the pitch, and don't forget the pause, where he uses the letter P over and over again. Martin Luther King Jr. also used this alliteration method in his most famous speech, which starts with, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, where he uses alliteration with the letter C and that hard C sound. The last example is metaphor, and that is when you use a figure of speech that describes a subject by asserting that it is, on some point of comparison, the same as an otherwise unrelated object. Winston Churchill used this quote, an appeaser is one who feeds the crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. Winston Churchill suggested that often when he was trying to come up with a metaphor, he would take himself on an imaginary walk, where he would envision things, and his favorite 2 places to go on these imaginary walks were to the nature and also to the zoo. And I'd like to finish with a Dr. Seuss quote, which managed to incorporate all 5 of the methods from Winston Churchill's suggestions. I have heard there are troubles of more than one kind. Some come from ahead, and some come from behind. But I've bought a big bat, and I'm ready, you see. Now my troubles are going to have troubles with me.